All right, hi everyone. So I want to welcome you to the June Helen seminar. I just want to start by acknowledging that no matter where we are today, if we're zooming in from Australia somewhere, we'll be zooming in from unceded or Aboriginal lands. And I want to particularly acknowledge the Tanorong people, which is the people of the lands where I am coming to you from, and also the traditional owners of the land where the Melbourne Law School is located, the Wurundjeri Woi people. And we will pay our respects to elders past, present, and future, and want to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. So, I have a really great seminar for you today. The title is Women's Reproductive Health Needs and Work, Lived Experience, Tensions, and most importantly, Solutions. And we're very lucky to have Tom Hvala here today. He is a PhD candidate at the Melbourne Law School. Um, and he his research adopts an intersectional approach to improving women's access to reproductive healthcare from a labour law perspective. Since graduating from Monash University with first class honours, Tom has practiced as a commercial lawyer and worked as a researcher in government and academia. He has published research regarding work and women's reproductive rights, health, and sexual harassment in the Federal Law Review, Sydney Law Review, and the NSW Law Journal. I want to also acknowledge that today this seminar is co-hosted not just by Helen, the Health Law and Ethics Network, but also the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law, and also the Reproductive Justice Hallmark Research Initiative. So we thank all those institutes for supporting us today. So this will be a slightly different Helen seminar. We're going to have Tom give his talk, and then we're going to go to one of Tom's supervisors, Beth Gaze, to get some comments. And Beth Gaze teaches equality and discrimination law and administrative law at the Melbourne Law School. Her research interests are in anti-discrimination and equality law, feminist legal thought, administrative law, including tribunals, and socio-legal research, including empirical research. She's been a member of several state and federal tribunals and consultant to the Victorian Parliament and the International Labour Organization, and has participated in law reform process and committees at state and federal levels. So, yeah, I'm really excited about today, and I will just hand over to Tom now. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks very much, Chris. Okay, as mentioned, I am Tom Hvala. I'm a PhD candidate with Melbourne Law School, and I joined in December. A key takeaway so far is that I'm learning that time goes very quickly while doing a PhD, but everything takes a lot longer than you might expect. But I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present this research today, and thank everyone for joining today's seminar. Just to reiterate, I want to thank Chris for his acknowledgement of country. I'm presenting from the law school at the moment, and I'm on Wurundjeri land and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank Helen, the Centre for Employment, Labour Relations Law, and the Reproductive Justice Hallmark for facilitating the event. I also want to note that in drawing on women's experiences from the BMC Women's Health article, I'll also raise issues that may be deeply personal, such as pregnancy loss and hardship with fertility. So if anyone is to hop off the call at any point, I invite you to do so. And I've also included some references to some support networks that might be relevant or if of interest. Otherwise, feel free to reach out at any point and I'll try and steer you in the right direction, including to the university's EAP support as well. So a little bit of context for this article, both personal but then academic. So the BMC Women's Health article, it was written before I joined here at Uni Melb in my capacity as a research affiliate with Monash's School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine. It was co-authored with Dr. Corinne Hummenberg. But the idea for this paper actually goes back getting close to 10 years ago when I was a rather ambitious and energetic and quite young Monash arts law student, where I had the opportunity to head over to the US and spend some time working in Congress in Washington, DC, with the House Judiciary Committee with the Democrats there. And as part of that experience, really firsthand saw, well, inadvertently and accidentally wandered into the March for Life, which is one of the biggest kind of anti-pro-choice protests out there, and came back just wondering, and just for me personally, wondering why that didn't really sit right. As part of this exchange, there was an academic component where I came back and I wrote on the constitutionality of buffer zone legislation that had just been introduced in Victoria. drawing on the experience of the East Melbourne Fertility Control Clinic. I went on to write this paper, and it was my first first introduction to long form research and writing. And it was a really engaging experience. The article that I wrote, very luckily, was published by a leading university over in the US. And then, of course, the High Court of Australia went on to decide the constitutionality of or whether or not the law was valid in Victoria in the decision of Clubb and Edwards. This was really my first insight into hard-fought feminist theory, acknowledging that it's a very broad discourse, of course, but also policy reform about women's reproductive health. Then that was almost 10 years ago, and the year would have been about 2017. I was doing my honours thesis in law, and so wanting to build on this experience, I emailed a few different employment lawyers and I asked them if they knew of any employment law issues because I was interested in the area, but anything that overlapped with gender. And one employment lawyer who worked with individual people and clients as opposed to big corporates, she replied saying she was uncertain whether women could use personal leave for IVF. She actually said, and this was as simple as the email was, it was very short. She said, we're getting questions from clients about this. Technically, it's not a legitimate use of personal leave. You're not ill or injured. So it makes for some really tricky conversations in the workplace. So I took that and dug a bit deeper. And turns out the problem was certainly a problem and rather dense at that. In a way, it was kind of threefold. There was a legal problem in the sense that this lawyer was right. Personal leave isn't necessarily a right fit for women undergoing IVF because of this threshold, this idea of illness and injury. It's a theoretical problem. I think it's really fraught to suggest that women's fertility might be an illness or an injury or otherwise disabling. There's also a practical issue, and one that I went on to characterize as an issue of uncertainty, given that women, including employment lawyers and those that might advise them, are unsure of what workplace supports and structures might be available to assist. Again, this problem, as I dug a bit deeper, began compounding in the sense that when I actually had a look at what was out there, there was essentially zero research and absolutely minimal guidance. So the Fair Work Ombudsman, for example, the main workplace authority in Australia, had published some guidance on sick leave and pregnancy, but the notion of pregnancy in that framework isn't quite a right fit for women undergoing IVF. Or alternatively, there were baby forums, which in terms of what's out there is a strange part of the internet. It's predominantly positive, but in some corners rather bizarre. But there were a few instances dealing directly with this issue, but the authority there in terms of actual concrete guidance for women in the same situation was obviously quite unreliable and nearly anecdotal. So the problem in a way became threefold because how do I as a researcher, also given my own positionality being a man, how do I write a whole honours thesis on this very gendered experience, but also as a man who hasn't personally undergone IVF nor had a partner who has. So in response to this last problem, with the support of a terrific supervisor at the time, Dr. Tanya Penovich, who's now Deakin, I interviewed 6 professionals about their insights. Ethics was an absolute hurdle. It took 3 goes. And I say that we interviewed professionals because it so happened that we were a little bit creative because really we wanted to prioritise women's direct experiences of IVF. We were knocked back from ethics on that basis, but then we interviewed professionals that so happened to have undergone IVF. When I say professionals, I mean people working in the space, whether it's healthcare providers or counsellors or similar. This was luckily published in the UNSW Law Journal, again, a little while ago now, 2018, with the help of a mentor, Dr. Gabrielle Golding, who's over at Adelaide. But now I bring all this context over to the current day, and this article now with the BMC article, the intention here was to expand the scope of inquiry, not only from IVF, but also to endometriosis. And I note here in this presentation, I'll be discussing both often at the same time, but of course they're very different conditions. They're also in some way related, given that a lot of women with endometriosis may use IVF at some point if they want to have a family. For me personally, I'll just note as well, the opportunity to maintain a connection with Monash was really fulfilling, and particularly the opportunity to work with Corinne. She's not joining us on the call today. She's recently retired and making the most of it overseas, but has a wealth of experience in IVF clinical services and the industry more broadly. So to work with her was great. A final note on methodology for the article as well is that even though I wrote my honours thesis 2017, even now still there's not a lot of research on this issue about particularly the intersection between women's reproductive rights and how it might apply or affect the workplace. So from my perspective, it's just as important that we continue to prioritise and include women's voices in how we might design a policy solution. So as a result, Corinne and I, we undertook a qualitative approach and we conducted semi-structured interviews. I'll be really transparent, there are definitely some limitations with this piece. We had a pretty small sample size that was largely my doing because of time constraints. I was working full-time as a commercial lawyer, so it was predominantly interviewing people when I had a moment in the evening. There was some recruitment bias in that we reached potential participants via social media or endometriosis social media networks. And I would say at the outset that there's a need to test these findings both in a quantitative sense, so to the extent that we want to generalize these findings, we do, but also, and hence my PhD, which I'll discuss a little bit later on, but also with Beth as well, how issues or facets of people's identities such as gender expression, sexuality, and even marital status, given that a lot of single women access IVF, how that might change or further complicate the situation. I just want to note before I go on and discuss the article as well that when referring to women, I do so inclusively and include trans women and individuals who experience these difficulties regardless of their assigned gender at birth. So a very brief overview of what I'll dive into. There's the findings from this article in terms of that dichotomy between problems and solutions. Some of the tensions more broadly. We have comments from Beth, and then Chris will be having a Q&A as well. So I'll jump straight in. So some of the findings, and the first one being pain. The most common symptom for women with endometriosis is pain. And this, when we interviewed women, was described in terms of two themes that emerged. The first relating to severity. I put up with pain for a long time, undiagnosed. I went to work all the time. It felt like I wanted to saw my body off from the top of my torso down. I'd be in that much pain. I thought that's what women went through. Not only the severity of pain, but also the duration or the frequency of that intense pain. I was just in pain throughout the month, rather than just those 2 or 3 days. I was just struggling to manage everyday activities. I'll say there's an established body of research somewhat when it comes to the symptoms and understanding experiences of endometriosis itself. But again, that's where Corinne and I really wanted to depart by actually looking at how these symptoms actually impacted women's work and managing pain in the workplace. So a key theme that emerged was the difficulty that women have managing these symptoms, regardless of what kind of job they have. So office jobs, for example, sitting at my desk and I have cramps. Sometimes my knees really hurt as well. So trying to sit there and focus on what I'm doing. Of course, physical jobs too. One woman said, it's difficult having endometriosis because I'm on my feet. I average about 15,000 steps a shift. So I'm on my feet running around constantly. So it's not something I could even attempt when I do have my flares. This was a key point that was raised by not only women in the office, but physical jobs and of course, many diverse jobs in which that might take place too. One woman said, who was in the army, in the reserve, she said, if I was experiencing bloating, I'd struggle to get into my uniform. The same with the IVF process. When you take stimulation drugs, you get puffy and fluid retention and all those types of things. I wouldn't do any heavy lifting. By extension to the impact of pain medication in order to deal with the severity and the frequency of that pain would sometimes meant that women were unable to drive, whether getting to or from work or for work itself. It's interesting and I think really complicated about how this experience or how this pressure to perform really began to emerge, and women really spoke to this as well, focusing on the impact of what their reproductive health needs had on their ability to work. So firstly, there was incredible and real pressure not to take time off work, despite the intensity of the symptoms. One woman said, I sit there with my phone trying to message my boss and be writing. What do I say? What do I tell him? And I'd be like, get out of bed and go to work, because it's private and it's uncomfortable. That was challenging, and I used to go to work feeling like crap. constantly so embarrassing to be looking over your shoulder to make sure you haven't bled through. Really heavy, really awkward, but that's just what happens. In terms of a pressure to perform, women also spoke to the notion of guilt or an undue need to prove oneself. I've had thoughts of would the company be better off with someone that didn't have an illness like that, because they've had to miss quite a lot of work because of it. From a practical perspective, there was an exhaustion of sick leave. So briefly, particularly for the non-employment lawyers in the room, and not to get too legal or anything like that, the Fair Work Act, it allows the national employment standards, which are like the bedrock, in a way, like a minimal kind of form of rights of sorts. I'm generalizing here very much. They allow for 10 days of personal leave or sick leave if you're ill or injured, as I mentioned towards the start of this presentation. What we found, though, is that those 10 days, if women could use them, often in the cases of endometriosis, where that pain is so intense that they were able to, that 10 days would be exhausted sometimes pretty quickly. From a workplace point of view, it's always been a really difficult thing, especially when I went into full-time work, because I'd lose all my sick leave within the first 2 months of starting a job. And then to have surgery, I lose pay every month because I can't really use my annual leave. Take a massive pay cut and have in all my jobs, basically. I think here, if I may, in speaking off the cuff, I think it's really important to acknowledge the financial element of both endometriosis and IVF. So with IVF, we know that the rounds of IVF, and often women will undergo quite a few rounds before they have, if they have a light birth. It's incredibly expensive, shockingly so. And then also with endometriosis, not only the opportunity cost of, say, pain and missing work, but also the cost of a laparoscopy, which is necessary for a diagnosis, but also to treat endometriosis is incredible. I'll add to this vulnerability is pronounced for women engaged in precarious work, meaning work that isn't permanent or ongoing, so casual work or fixed term contracts, which I note themselves are usually gendered. So it's definitely been challenging being casual as well, being punished if you take the day off. Are your shifts getting cancelled in the future, and having your workplaces think you're lazy? I recall, and some of that quote I think hints at notions of direct discrimination, but I recall this interview and this person had actually experienced direct discrimination in being overlooked for a promotion and managerial opportunity because of her endometriosis and because she had taken sick leave as well. So yeah, it's certainly a complicated issue, but the impacts are great. And it begs the questions of, well, exhausting sick leave, what alternatives are there? And I know Beth will touch a little bit on this, but there's annual leave, but however, annual leave is meant for rest and recreation, at least notionally. There's unpaid leave, or alternatively, some women have chosen to miss work or decrease work or even leave work in its entirety. So that was another theme that came out, the ways in which women reduced work or otherwise experienced really negative impacts on their career. So some participants, particularly those undergoing IVF, described moving from full-time to part-time work to help manage IVF. In some instances, women left to work altogether. So we spoke with one participant who actually told us that when undergoing IVF, she took a voluntary redundancy so she could focus on her IVF round that was coming up, because previously she'd been too stressed to balance work and treatment. Other interviewees told us that time off work to manage their reproductive health negatively impacted their career. So for example, as far as career progression goes, I do feel like my promotion has been delayed because I've had to take time out. Same with mat leave. The military try not to punish women for going on mat leave or taking personal leave. But if you're not in the office, not being reported on, it's difficult for them to assume that you would have done a good job if you were there. Obviously, this woman is in the Army Reserves, but I think we can quite fairly extend this vulnerability to most women's experiences. A key theme that emerged that I think is really important is this idea that endometriosis and IVF treatment can be all-consuming. I actually gave up my career for a family that didn't exist because I couldn't handle that anymore. I wanted to put all my focus into the IVF and everything like that. But at the time, it was a massive thing to be like infertility. Endometriosis has completely taken over my life. that I could not have the capacity to do a career that I've been doing for a decade. It's life-changing and all-consuming. I think for me, preparing these slides is actually this quote that really highlights, amongst all of them, but in particular this one, like the importance of the work we might do, whether it's as medical practitioners or academics, lawyers, advocates, or ethicists, to improve the experiences and lives that women with endometriosis or undergoing IVF might encounter and have. Rather serious conversation thus far, but I do want to just look at what potential solutions there are and try and put a bit more of a positive spin on what sometimes is a rather grim set of circumstances. And I say solutions in this sense that of working within current workplace structures, which will also be the focus of my PhD. But in terms of solutions and what might currently be available, and speaking to general workplaces, it's this idea of workplace flexibility and working from home. The women we spoke with really valued this to the extent that they had this available and they could use it. One woman said, knowing that I had the flexibility there was the biggest thing, that I could structure my day if I needed to come in a little bit later or jump out to an appointment. In addition is the idea of paid reproductive healthcare leave. And so briefly, I've included policies, enterprise agreements, awards, and national employment standards, meaning the ways in which these might be recognised. And in a way, this is somewhat cascading. Workplace policies, they're a good start, however, limited in the sense that they apply to only one workplace at a time. Also, whether or not they're contractually binding or enforceable is also a little bit legally unclear. Enterprise agreements, which are a little bit more enforceable if you have access to one. This is actually becoming a really exciting space in which some more progressive workplaces, including governments in a few different states, are now implementing paid reproductive healthcare leave in this way. Modern awards, we're not there yet, but then the national employment standards, which I referred to earlier. I will add a quote from one person we spoke with. She said, I think it would be really good to see that sort of policy available to casual workers, even though they're not entitled to sick leave. With the casualised workforce, so many people would be battling through this. And so it'd be amazing if that were available to everyone. I don't think that's an unreasonable proposition. I know that there's 10 days of paid domestic family violence leave available to all employees, including casuals, in the national employment standards. It took a long time to recognise that entitlement and legislate for it. I will say though, there is a really interesting analogy. I say this with a lot of sensitivity, but an analogy between domestic violence, family violence, and then reproductive health, in the sense that both are very gendered. It's but only women that shoulder the burden of dealing with domestic violence and managing reproductive health. But similarly, the financial elements or vulnerabilities, if I use that word, are similar in the sense that, as I mentioned, IVF and endometriosis can be very expensive and have really drastic financial implications. But similarly, we understand the importance of financial independence and work for women encountering domestic violence as well. So something for me potentially to workshop in the future. In that first IVF article that I wrote, the UNSW piece, I did discuss that at some length. I think really importantly too, thirdly, is this idea of workplace trust, understanding and education. One woman said, I think just an understanding workplace would be best, like educating our workplace, that sometimes you do need to go home because of your period or because of the pain. And on a really positive note, one woman remarked, the culture is changing and workplaces are realizing that people can be trusted and that you can work from home. People can be trusted that they want to keep their jobs, that things do happen. I do want to contextualize that. I mean, I draw on the recent federal election as well, in which it was almost looking like the work from home idea was going to become an election issue. I can't really recall whether it was dropped in the end, but I do just want to emphasize that these supports, to the extent that any of us have managerial responsibilities or have people beneath us working and that we manage, that these entitlements are incredibly useful for people that might need them in the context of endometriosis or ducking out for a quick counselling appointment with IVF or otherwise as well. Some tensions, and in a way I kind of laughed to myself this morning where I was looking at some really tense sort of problems and then looking at solutions, and now back into maybe a more tense area looking at tensions specifically, where, and don't worry, I ended on a more positive note. But I think there's one, which is how we should approach gender equality in the workplace and whether or not we recognise women's bodies as different. I know Beth will be noting her work and expertise in this area as well. I'll briefly say that this has been a feminist debate, and again, I acknowledge that feminism is a very broad discourse, but it's a perennial issue of sorts. And within a labour law context, there's a lot of disagreement about whether, to what extent, equality should permit the legal protection of working women because of their gender. And we see some feminists take the position that equality is consistent with diversity of treatment, where genuine sex-based differences arise. But then we also see at the other end of the spectrum the idea that equal treatment compels the same treatment of women and men in the workplace, thus requiring the absorption of pregnancy and, say, fertility-related issues into a general rubric of labour law as it currently exists. I will say, if I may, that latter approach in which formal equality might treat men and women exactly the same no matter what, it's been rebuked in the sense that when you look at and consider who the law is designed for, it tends to really preference the idea of an unencumbered male worker without any caring responsibilities. And Beth will again provide a bit more commentary around that. There's a question, I think, of whether cultural shift in the workplace is possible. Maybe a little bit more broadly, what is the role of employers in this space? So I draw on the voice referendum, which we saw employers of many different sorts, but for example, in the big corporates kind of space, drawing on my experience as a lawyer in that kind of space, there was a lot of backlash towards those employers when the no vote eventuated as the outcome. And so I just wonder, how do workplaces really grapple with that tension as to the extent that they should be championing DEI initiatives, given everything that's happening in the US and that uncertainty there as well? There's the issue and attention of privacy and the actual uptake of workplace supports. For example, if we were to have a reproductive health provision without that understanding, trust and education on the last slide that I mentioned, for example, if someone were using that to undergo IVF, it's an incredibly vulnerable position to be in, because essentially you might be foreshadowing to your employer that if you're undergoing IVF, that intention to become pregnant. And with that, of course, we know that pregnancy and discrimination on the basis of pregnancy is a persistent issue and a live one still in 2025. There's also the question of who pays for this workplace entitlement as well, which we knew or know that that was a really big issue for the emergence or development of domestic and family violence leave as well. So a little bit tense there, but then I try and go a bit more positive. So let's look at some meaningful change and some growing interest in this space. So a tiny bit about myself and what I'm doing is, so having joined the law school in December, my PhD will, with the support of the Reproductive Justice hallmark, but then also the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law as well, I'll be undertaking an intersectional feminist labour law perspective, not only looking at women's experiences generally, but particularly culturally and racially marginalised women's experiences of IVF and work, really as an extension of some of the work that I mentioned at the start of this presentation. My supervisors are Alicia Blackham and Beth and Leah Rupana. And I'll be applying a reproductive justice framework, which is kind of broad in the sense that there are a few different parts to it, but it really prioritises a rededication for radical politics and community activism as well. We've seen some supports become available and develop. So there's Samantha Payne with Pink Elephant. She's a formidable leader. And this Pink Elephant really supports women grappling with pregnancy loss and families more generally. Also Endozone, that have really terrific supports for employers looking to support employees with endometriosis. There's growing, and really pleased that there's growing research and interest in this area. So a recent article by Wong, Uxley and Turnbull, for example, undertook a quantitative approach looking at women's attitudes towards the paid reproductive health care leave provision. Really excitingly, it found that 85% of women expressed being somewhat to definitively in favour of paid reproductive health leave. I will say, and they acknowledge this, there is of course some, I guess, bias within that, because it begs the question of what would men possibly think, or the broader population, in the same way that the BMC article as well grappled with that limitation. But I think there's a lot of hope that comes from that, and it's really pleasing to see that research. Then, of course, there are other researchers in this space. So Danny Howe's Indoor at Work project, in which he's co-designing workplace guidelines for women's lived experience of endometriosis at the centre of her project. There's also Sydney Colossi's New Equality Bargaining for a New Generation of Reproductive Rights PhD out of UCID, looking at menstrual leave and a few other gender entitlements as well. And then I'll conclude on just noting as well, what's been really promising is to see the government take interest in this area, and I would say just kind of cohesively take it seriously. At a Victorian level, we've seen the inquiry into women's pain and of health. From last time I checked, that inquiry hasn't been published yet. It's been somewhat delayed, but it should be any moment now. And then at the Commonwealth level with the Senate, we've seen an inquiry to menopause and perimenopause, which is as equally a very important part of this broader conversation. And that report actually touches upon some of these issues, such as paid reproductive leave. Mindful I've just spoken a lot, sometimes very quickly, but at this point, I'm very happy to pause and then maybe ask for comments from Beth. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Tom, for the introduction. And I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm presenting on Wurundjeri land and acknowledge the care that has been taken of the land over the generations. And also just to say what I'm going to do, I think Tom's project comes through as being really quite a broad one, because he's taking account of both the legal regulations and the practice of how it is that people actually operate in this area. And I think that's one of the really important things, because lawyers tend to focus on what are the legal rules and then tend to miss a whole lot of what are the other issues that might come up for someone. So I will just touch on that as I go through, because I think, in fact, the way that this operates in our society sets up a whole lot of catch-22s for women. So where they are just stuck in this position where there is no easy way out for them to resolve it. And so I think the work that he's doing is really important in trying to formalise and work out a solution that individual women don't have to sort themselves. Okay, so what I want to focus on is labour law and reproduction. And of course, one of the problems for lawyers is that law assumes a gender neutral subject. So law doesn't think about men and women, law just thinks about there is a person. And of course, by default, that person is male. So, you know, despite the fact that people might say, no, it's not a man, it actually always is a man. That's who is in mind. And that's the basis of the feminist critique of both legal doctrine and legal method, that it's there and who you have in mind is a man. So what that means is, because we have a man in mind, we don't take account of women's differences for men. And so those are problems that women are left to navigate by themselves. So this is all, you know, feminist legal critique from the early 1990s. There's nothing new in this, but we're talking about applying this in a new context. So what does it mean in the context of women undertaking reproductive technologies or dealing with the pain involved in something like endometriosis? So the fight for feminist recognition in law has always been the fight to remove these disadvantages and to have women recognised as being full legal subjects in the same way as men are, and not as special characteristics needing special accommodation. So this has been fought in areas like sex discrimination, work-family conflict, and that whole idea that women's rights matter as much as men's, and they're not just an add-on to men's rights. They're actually something that is just as important as men's rights. So that's sort of the basic architecture of the area, if you like. And we've made progress in these areas. So it took a long time to have the fight over sex discrimination, then the fight over sexual harassment. It's taken a long time to have the fight over work-family conflict, and even the ability to get parental leave and so on. So we can see that over time, progress is made, but it is extremely slow, and each area needs to be fought out individually. So one of the things I thought might be worth looking at is our conditions of work at Melbourne University, just to, again, bring home how difficult this is in practice for women. And so going through the enterprise agreement, I just did a search on sex, and sex appears once in the enterprise agreement. So we're not paying a lot of attention to it. And it appears in a provision that includes a same-sex partner in the parental leave provisions. So it's not there in terms of recognising sex differences for women. It's there in terms of including same-sex partnerships. Sexual harassment is referred to twice in the enterprise agreement. So that's good. It's good that it's there. But again, neither of those references is going to solve our problems in this area. If we actually need to pay attention to sex, then this way of formulating the enterprise agreement is not going to do it for us. There were no other references to sex in the enterprise agreement. So what does that do for women who are undertaking reproductive technologies, who might need to identify leave that's appropriate for them to take in order to do this? And given that reproductive technologies are completely gendered undertaking, everything occurs within the female body, and it's the women who need to make time available and undergo the various processes that are necessary. So yeah, I think, you know, it's quite a challenge for thinking about how are women going to actually manage this. So I thought I'd actually just show you some of the provisions in the enterprise agreement, because it's quite interesting to actually see what's there and what they refer to. So the paid personal leave provision actually refers to personal illness or injury, including pregnancy-related illness. But of course, undergoing reproductive technologies doesn't fall into either of those categories, as Tom has shown us. So that really doesn't cover undergoing reproductive technologies. There's provision for unpaid personal leave, but again, that is still personal illness or injury. So again, in theory, it doesn't really cover reproductive technologies. So it can be sort of, you know, fudged to say, well, take this instead, but it's not really designed for that purpose. And seems quite strange, given that we've had reproductive technologies around for decades, that we have failed to actually take it into account in any more significant way. There are provisions now for special leave that are in the enterprise agreement. So the university is committed to supporting employees who need extended paid absence to deal with certain personal matters. So extended paid absence, again, sort of doesn't really sound like undergoing reproductive technologies, but perhaps it is. So in addition to personal leave, employees engaged in continuing or fixed-term employment can apply for special leave of absence, where their health, wellbeing, attendance or performance is impacted by menstruation, perimenopause or menopause, or chronic health issues or medical treatment. Okay, so this one looks like it will apply to reproductive technologies. So it does refer to medical treatment, which I guess is reproductive technologies would be a medical treatment. But again, it's their performance is impacted by, so it's sort of, again, it's not really drafted in a way that would really appear appropriate for reproductive technologies, but it does actually cover it. So there is a provision there now, and we should be pleased that actually the enterprise agreement does cover it. But again, it's discretionary. You know, employees may apply for this. There's no real guarantee that they're going to be granted it. So what do we need? And obviously Tom is going to come up with some answers to this question. And this will be, you know, I think an important part of his work. I think he will diagnose the issue first and think about the implications. But I think based on experiences, it's going to be important. And of course, one of the experiences women have, I'll wind up in a moment, but are things that are not obvious. So for example, when women are going for job interviews, they might be pretty interested in what the parental leave provisions are of an employer, because they may well be considering having children. But if they ask the question about, well, what are your parental leave provisions? they've just raised a red flag in front of whoever the interview panel is, going, well, I'm thinking about having children. If you really don't want women to be having children in your workforce, I might be a good person to avoid. And so and again, that would be discriminatory for an employer to take that into account, but proving that it's been taken into account is a very difficult thing to do. And that red flag is there. If, for example, we had something like employers must make clear to any applicant exactly what their parental leave provisions are, and no one has to ask, it just comes back automatically when you put in the job application, then we wouldn't set up that sort of a booby trap for women who are asking those questions when men don't need to. So I think it's important to just think through these catch-22 and think about ways we can try and avoid setting up problems for women. So we need women to be treated as if their needs are basic human needs and not special and particular needs. And this is the sameness difference debate that's grumbled along under feminist legal critique for decades. I think what we're talking about is applying this to a new context, and hopefully trying to resolve some of those issues in a way, is how to allow for those differences and still treat individuals as equals and fairly when they can't be treated the same. So that's, sorry about my spell checking there. What criteria can we use to treat people as equals without insisting on sameness? That's the challenge that we face in this area. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. I should just mention disability law provides some indications of possibilities for doing this, because with disability law we have to treat people differently, and so treating people equally across difference is one of the possibilities that arises from disability law. Okay, so thanks very much for that, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity to add some comments.
Great, thanks, Beth. Thanks, Tom. So that's well done. It's a lot of talking to do in an hour. So really appreciate you coming and sharing your updates on this really interesting work that you're doing. There are some still interesting things going on in the chat. So I just quickly note that Dr. Rachel McDougall has noted some links with her PhD thesis on breastfeeding and work entitlements in Australia and the need for clear entitlements, clearer than anti-discrimination law can provide. So yeah, thank you all. So Helen will not be back in July because we'll take a little mid-semester break, but we'll see you all for the Helen seminar in August. If you're not a part of the Helen mailing list, there is a link in the chat, so please sign up. And apart from that, I wish you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.